This is a brief introduction on dipole antennas. The most common basic dipole is approximately 1/2 wavelength long and fed in the center with 50 ohm coax. Preferably it is horizontal and about 1/2 wavelength above the ground. Such a dipole is really a good antenna. It has many advantages over more complex antennas. Most antennas are evaluated in terms of gain. One factor that is sometimes overlooked is the pattern of the antenna. Just where is that gain? Gain can never be in all directions at once. You must sacrifice gain in one direction to have it in another. We should always talk about gain in reference to something. We sometimes use gain relative to a dipole, but this really is not a good thing to do. The gain of a real dipole depends on its height above ground, the direction it is pointed, and the elevation angle. The best way to describe gain is to use dBi. The reference, or 0 dBi, assumes that all of the available power is radiated equally in all directions. Mathematically, this is an easy calculation and is very precise. I will in almost all cases use dBi when comparing antenna gain. The gain of a horizontal half-wave dipole is about 7 dBi. That gain is broadside to the antenna axis. This is the plot of a horizontal dipole, 1/2 wavelength above the ground. Okay, in order to understand what this chart means, we are looking down on a half-wave dipole antenna. The dipole wire is running vertically up and down on the chart so that the maximum radiation is broadside to the dipole. The maximum gain off the broadside of the dipole is equal on either side, 7.6 dBi gain. Off the ends of the dipole, the signal is reduced about 10 dB. What this means is if you're listening to somebody off the broadside of the dipole and you rotate the dipole 90 degrees until that person is off the end of the antenna, his signal strength will go down or decrease almost 10 dB, and that is a significant decrease. Now this chart is showing the elevation angles or takeoff angle of radiation either to or from the antenna. By looking at the graph, we can see that the maximum radiation is at a 30-degree angle. Any radiation, either transmitted or received, above or below that 30-degree angle is not going to be as strong in intensity as it is at the 30-degree point. Now, so far we have talked about a dipole a half-wave above the ground, but the question frequently comes up, is a higher antenna better? And the answer is maybe, maybe not. Let's take a look at a graph of two antennas, one a half wave above the ground and one a full wave above the ground. In other words, one antenna is twice as high as the other. In this case, the red trace shows an antenna a half wave high. The blue trace an antenna a full wavelength high. Now, as we look at this, we notice the antenna that is a half wave high has only one lobe on each side. The one that is a full wave high has two lobes. And where you had a peak on the red graph, you have a null on the blue graph. Now what this means is the radiation from the dipole that is 1/2 wavelength above the ground peaks at 30 degrees. The radiation from the dipole that is 1 wavelength high has two peaks. It also has a null at 30 degrees. Now, one of the things we can get from this is that if you're receiving somebody on a dipole that is 1/2 wavelength high, and the radiation angle that you're receiving him from, or to and from, transmitting and receiving from, is 30 degrees. If you were to raise your antenna double the height of your antenna from 1/2 wavelength to 1 wavelength, his signal strength would go down about 20 dB. Now, this is a case where an antenna being 1 wavelength high would actually be too high in order to communicate with the desired station. Now, if the desired station was at a further distance away, you would probably want to utilize a lower radiation angle, such as maybe 15 degrees. So if you're trying to communicate with somebody that is much further away and you need a lower radiation angle, then the antenna or the dipole at 1 wavelength high would give you a bit better gain. Now, for general purposes, I tend to go with the dipole a 1/2 wave high. It seems to be a very good compromise and gives me pretty much what I want. Many times I've said if I could put up my 4-element 20-meter monoband Yagi, I would probably put it up at a 1/2 wavelength this time. That would probably give me a much better antenna for sweepstakes. It would be good for DX. It would be a good general purpose antenna. If I wanted to work, let's say, Japan and China all the time, then I probably would want to raise the antenna as high as I could get it. However, for most practical purposes, having a dipole or any antenna a 1/2 wavelength high is an extremely good distance. Now, this next chart compares a dipole 1 wavelength high in red to a dipole 2 wavelengths high in blue. Notice the higher the dipole, the more lobes you have, the more nulls you have. And of course, the higher the antenna, the lower the first peak is. This antenna has about 7.6 dB gain at maybe 10-12 degrees. This might be fairly good for DX, but you're limiting yourself to good reception only at certain discrete elevation angles. And this is one reason that I wouldn't want to go that high. Now, the nulls that you see are theoretical nulls. Thank goodness, in practical purposes, when you're in a neighborhood, you're over top of real ground, you have houses nearby, automobiles parked in the driveway, what have you, the nulls will not be quite as sharp and as deep as you see when you do an easy neck plot. So all this probably leads you to the question, so what are the angles that we should really want? You know, what is a radiation angle that I would expect to talk to somebody, let's say in California, halfway across the United States, maybe somebody in Europe? What elevation angle would I need for Japan, Australia? Well, there's no real simple answer for this. This is a copy of a page out of one of my Virginia Tech textbooks when I studied radio wave propagation quite some years ago. Basically, not much has changed. This chart shows your single hop distance versus the radiation angle in degrees. And if you look at it, you can see that if you want to work 500 miles via the E region, you probably are going to have a radiation angle just above 10 degrees. If you're going to use the F layer, your angles are going to be 40 degrees. 50 degrees, 60 degrees. It's quite a variation here. Now, what we see is A lot of this depends on which layer of the ionosphere that you're using. It also depends on the height of that layer. In general, like we're talking a single hop distance of 500 miles. If the F layer is moving up and down, you can expect to be using an angle of around 40 degrees to maybe 80 degrees for that 500-mile distance. Now, one thing that you will notice, and that will happen, is that as the level of the ionosphere, height of the ionosphere changes during your course of communication with somebody, you may find that the signal strength varies up and down. When the height of the ionosphere and all the other conditions are just perfect, you'll have a very strong signal. When the height of the ionosphere and other conditions change a little bit, the signal strength will fade down and then come back up again. So there's various things that are going to happen that you'll notice as you are in communications with somebody for any length of time at all. Now, I don't mean to imply that when you hear fading, it is all because of your antenna's radiation angle and the variation of the height of the ionosphere. Fading is a very complicated subject. It's going to be caused by changes in density of the ionosphere as well as the height of the ionosphere. So there's a whole lot involved when you hear signals fading in and out. In general, just before a band closes, the density of the ionosphere is decreasing, and as the density of the ionosphere decreases, it gets to a certain point where you have minimum absorption in the ionosphere, and you will find that signals are going to increase significantly in strength at a certain density, and usually that happens just before the band goes dead and you lose all contact with that station. Now here's another chart that shows about the same thing. This shows multiple hops. If you look at the first curve to the left, there's the number 1 there. That's a single hop distance versus elevation angle. And when you get out to a certain point, you're going to need to take 2 hops to make that distance. And when you drop back to 2 hops, you're back up to maybe the 15-degree angle again. And then as you increase your range, your optimal angle decreases to a point where then you need to use 3 hops. And then you're back up to something greater than 10 or 12 degrees. And then as the distance increases again, your angle will be lower, and then you will pop up to where you need to take 4 hops, and you'll be back up to 10 degrees again. So looking at this chart, you can see that 10 degrees is not a bad angle for an antenna. And it will cover multiple hops, 1 hop, 2 hop, 3 hops, 4 hops. And these are for extremely long distances. On the 15-meter band, most signals from northeast USA to Europe are just below the 5 and 10-degree angles. In that case, a dipole, 1 wavelength or 46 feet, would be excellent. Now, having gone through all of that, let's go back and look at the dipole a half-wave high. Even though it has its maximum radiation at 30 degrees, if we drop down to the 10-degree point, we can see that we're only about 3 dB down from the peak signal at 30 degrees. So even if we're trying to work DX in the neighborhood of 10 degrees, we are giving up about 3 dB of signal strength. Now, that's not that's not all that bad when you consider that you're gaining a whole lot more angle coverage. You can cover a whole lot more angles effectively with a dipole a half wave above the ground than you can a dipole that is one wave or two waves above the ground. The absence of nulls in the desired range of elevation angles is frequently more desirable than pure gain. From a practical standpoint, the one wave high antenna would be useful more of the time than the antenna two waves high. In some cases, the half wave high antenna is even more useful. I want to note at this point the really big contest stations have antennas at multiple heights, and they have them phased to give both gain and a broader elevation response than any one antenna. But that's beyond the scope of this particular discussion today. Now, this is a measurement I made on one of my 15-meter antennas. It was at 55 feet, and it was an excellent performing antenna. I use this mostly in DX contests. Now, there are many other dipole configurations. A dipole can be at any orientation from horizontal to vertical. The best performance is with a dipole fully horizontal. You get a full 7+ dBi gain off the broadside. As the dipole is rotated to the vertical position, the gain will decrease and the directivity decreases as well. At the completely vertical position, you have the lowest gain and no directivity at all. Now, the dipole, the horizontal dipole, is going to require two supports, two trees, two towers between the house and a tree or whatever. Other orientations, such as a sloping dipole, can require just one tall tree or one support. The inverted V also requires just one tall support, and the gain is just a little bit less than a flat dipole. So in many cases, an inverted V is also an excellent antenna. Now, this is an easy neck plot of the inverted V in the blue trace and a completely horizontal dipole, red trace. The dipole at 46 feet and the inverted V at exactly the same height, 46 feet. And as you can see by the plots, there's very little difference between the two antennas, with the horizontal dipole edging out the inverted V by just maybe 1 or 2 dB. And note also by looking at the plot that the inverted V has a little bit more radiation at the high elevation angles. And this might be of some advantage on 40 meters, probably not so much on the higher bands. Now, this plot shows a horizontal dipole, an inverted V, and a sloping 45-degree dipole at all at the same height, 46 feet. There are times when I use a sloping dipole. I can use one support, and I can walk the end out until the antenna is at about a 45-degree angle. This is significantly better than just a vertical dipole. It's not quite as good as an inverted V. So if I had my choice, I might go with the inverted V. That requires walking two ends out. The sloping dipole at a 45-degree, you only have to walk out one end. So there are times and locations, depending on your trees, your yard, and what have you, that a sloping dipole at about a 45-degree angle is maybe the best you can do. A lot easier to put up than a horizontal dipole, and you just may want to take a shortcut and do that. Right now at my current location, I have inverted V's and I have sloping dipoles. Due to the configuration of the trees and the amount of time that I wanted to put into it at this location, I opted not to try to get up any fully horizontal dipoles. and I'm having extremely good luck with inverted V's and sloping dipoles. Now this is a quick look at a plot of a 45-degree sloping dipole and an inverted V, both at the same height. This is at a very low elevation angle of 12 degrees, which would be good for DX into Europe in particular. And there is very, very little difference in radiation intensity at that 12-degree point. Here's a little variation of the simple dipole. A dipole with a reflector. You can take and add a parasitic element, either a reflector or a director, parallel to the dipole and spaced about 8 feet away to form a wire Yagi. Adding a reflector or director can give a significant increase in gain. This is a picture of my 15-meter wire Yagi. As you can see to the right, there is a conventional dipole fed with coax. To the left is you might call it a dipole. The center is not broken, so it is just a half-wave piece of wire. I'm using wooden spacers that I've varnished to hold the two elements at about 8 feet apart. I've done this very successfully on 10 meters and on 15 meters. Now this is an elevation plot of a 15-meter two-element sloper, a sloping dipole and a horizontal dipole at 46 feet. As you can see, and these are all just using one support. As you can see, the 15-meter two-element antenna has significantly more gain. It's about 4 dB, at least 4 dB gain at a fairly low elevation angle. The elevation angle is about 15 degrees. The peak of the antenna, the highest point of the antenna is 46 feet above the ground. Now you can do the same thing with inverted V elements. Here's a plot showing a good inverted V Yagi versus the 15-meter sloping antenna that I typically would use. The difference is pretty insignificant. Doing an inverted V Yagi requires significant more effort than using a sloping Yagi. There may be times that somebody may prefer to do that. I just don't think the effort, I don't think there's enough payback to warrant the effort of doing an inverted V Yagi, particularly at 15 meters or 10 meters or even on 20 meters. Now the next thing I want to talk about are multi-wire dipoles. I've found this to be a real winner. Instead of having a single wire dipole for one band, I like to parallel multiple dipole elements. The first picture here is a 40, 20, 10 meter dipole. It actually works on 40, 20, 15, and 10 meters. The 40-meter element also works on 15 meters. This is a great 4-band antenna. The next picture is a close-up of the center. The center is fed, all the wires come together right at the center, and the wires spread out. I'm using PVC drinking water spacers. The spacing doesn't have to be as big as this. My later antennas, I'm not using as much space between the wires. It's a fairly easy antenna to tune. The next picture shows a 2-band, 2-wire dipole, and it's pretty much sloping at a 45-degree angle. Using one support, maybe 50 foot up in a tall pine tree, and then I walk the lower end out as far as I can, or to some convenient support that I can reach. Um, this is again a fairly quick and easy antenna to put up, and it works extremely well. Easy to tune. Now, in case you're wondering how well these antennas work, uh, here's some contest results from about 4 years. Uh, all antennas were fan dipole or a multi-wire dipole. 2010, let's see, 2010 I worked 103 countries on 40 meters, 105 on 20, 101 countries on 15 meters, and that is in one weekend with a fan dipole at about 55 feet. 2011, 104 countries on 40, 104 on 20, 113 on 15, and 104 countries on 10 meters with a fan dipole. 2011 in the CQWW sideband contest, 101 countries on 20 meters, 112 countries on 10 meters with a fan dipole. And didn't quite make 100 countries on 15 meters in that contest. I only worked 96. Now, the point I want to make is you can work the world with simple dipole antennas. You can have a tremendous amount of fun. You can build your own antennas. It's inexpensive. You don't need anything extremely complicated to have fun in ham radio. In fact, I have some of the best times working contests with simple antennas. It's very, very satisfying to do a good job with something you built yourself.